A pattern emerged in the radio spectrum that no public observatory was supposed to detect, a whisper of organized signal buried beneath the thermal noise and cosmic static, faint enough to be dismissed as interference, but structured enough to make 3 separate research teams fall silent when they saw it. And every one of those teams, working independently across different continents, sent their findings not to academic journals or press offices, but to a single classified address in Nevada, a location that officially does not monitor interstellar objects and officially does not exist in the capacity that everyone knows it exists. A place where dust and secrecy have mingled for so long that they have become indistinguishable from each other, where the desert stretches out in all directions like a barrier against curiosity, and where someone, perhaps many someones, know things about 3I divided by Atlas that the rest of humanity was never meant to discover. Welcome to the sleepy cosmos. Tonight, we explore what Area 51 might know about 3I divided by Atlas, and what the rest of us were never meant to see. The story begins not with conspiracy but with geography, with the simple fact that certain places on Earth are better suited than others for listening to the universe, for catching the faint electromagnetic whispers that drift down from space carrying information about distant galaxies and stellar explosions, and perhaps sometimes messages that were never intended for human ears. Area 51 sits in the Nevada desert, isolated and vast, surrounded by restricted airspace and government land that extends for hundreds of square miles in every direction, a buffer zone that keeps civilians and their questions at a comfortable distance. But the isolation serves another purpose beyond secrecy, beyond hiding aircraft prototypes and weapons testing from foreign satellites and curious eyes. The desert is quiet in ways that few places on Earth can match anymore. Quiet in the electromagnetic sense, free from the radio pollution that blankets most inhabited regions, free from the constant chatter of cell phones and television broadcasts and wireless networks that create a fog of artificial signals obscuring the natural emissions from the cosmos. In the desert, with the right equipment and the right filters, you can hear things that would be lost anywhere else, can detect patterns and structures in the radio spectrum that require silence to perceive, require the absence of human noise to reveal themselves against the background hiss of the universe. The facilities at Area 51 have always been about more than aircraft, though the aircraft testing is real and documented, and provides convenient cover for other activities that are less easily explained to congressional oversight committees and budget reviewers. Among those other activities is a signals intelligence operation that has been running continuously since the late 1960s, an array of antenna and receivers and processors that sweep the sky methodically, listening to everything, recording everything, analyzing everything with algorithms that have grown increasingly sophisticated as computing power has expanded over the decades. The official purpose of this listening program is to monitor foreign communications and satellite transmissions, to track potential threats and gather intelligence that might be relevant to national security. And that purpose is genuine, is a real function of the equipment and the personnel who operate it. But the same hardware that can intercept a transmission from a reconnaissance satellite can also detect natural radio emissions from pulsars and quasars and the ionized gas clouds around dying stars, can observe the radio signature of comets as their tails interact with the solar wind, can potentially identify anomalies that do not fit the expected patterns of astronomical phenomena or human technology. This dual nature of the surveillance program, simultaneously mundane and extraordinary, military and scientific, has existed for decades without generating much attention because most of what the receivers detect is exactly what you would expect them to detect, as weather satellites and communication relays, and the occasional amateur radio operator with too much power in their transmitter is the normal background of human civilization's electromagnetic presence, mixed with the equally normal emissions from natural cosmic processes. The analysts who sit in climate-controlled rooms reviewing the data have become accustomed to the rhythms of normal, have developed an intuitive sense for what belongs and what stands out, what can be filed away as routine, and what requires a second look, a deeper analysis. A report to supervisors who might escalate it further up chains of command that eventually lead to rooms where decisions are made about what information enters the public domain and what information remains in the shadows. When 3I divided by Atlas was first detected by conventional astronomical surveys, when it appeared as a faint moving point of light in images captured by telescopes dedicated to finding asteroids and comets that might pose a threat to Earth, it was immediately flagged as unusual because of its orbital characteristics, because the trajectory calculations showed that it was not bound to our Sun, was not a permanent resident of our solar system, but rather a visitor from interstellar space. Only the second such object ever confirmed after the enigmatic passage of Oumuamua several years earlier. The astronomical community responded with excitement and mobilized their resources to study this rare opportunity, to gather as much data as possible about an object that represented a sample of another stellar system, a piece of cosmic material that had formed around a different star and had traveled through the galaxy to pass briefly through our neighborhood before continuing on its eternal journey. But while astronomers at universities and observatories around the world were pointing their optical and infrared telescopes at 3I divided by Atlas, measuring its brightness and spectrum and rotation rate, the receivers at Area 51 were doing something else. Were listening in frequency ranges that most astronomical facilities do not routinely monitor, were applying filters and analysis techniques developed for signals intelligence rather than astronomy, were looking not just at the object itself, but at the space around it, at the entire radio environment within which the object existed. And approximately 2 weeks after the first optical detection, at a time when 3I divided by Atlas was still quite distant from the Sun and exhibiting only minimal cometary activity, one of those receivers detected something that should not have been there, a narrowband radio emission at a frequency of approximately 1420 MHz, right in the middle of what radio astronomers call the water hole, a protected region of the spectrum where transmissions are prohibited by international agreement because it contains natural emission lines from hydrogen and hydroxyl that are considered prime candidates for interstellar communication. Natural frequencies that any technological civilization with an understanding of chemistry would recognize as significant. The emission was weak, barely above the noise threshold, and it lasted for only 6 minutes before fading back into the background static. If the system had not been specifically configured to watch that region of the spectrum, if the timing had been slightly different, if any number of small variables had been altered, the signal would have gone undetected, would have passed through Earth's radiosphere without leaving any record of its existence. But the system was watching, and the timing was perfect, and the signal was captured and recorded and processed through multiple layers of analysis that looked for patterns and structure and any indication that this was something other than a natural fluctuation in the cosmic background. What the analysis revealed was ambiguous, but intriguing. The signal showed a degree of organization that was difficult to explain through purely natural mechanisms, showed what looked like modulation, like information was being encoded in the variations of amplitude and frequency, though the pattern was not immediately recognizable as any known form of communication or data transmission. It was not the kind of clearly artificial signal that SETI researchers hoped to find, not the obvious regular pulse or mathematical sequence that would unambiguously indicate intelligent origin, but it was also not quite like any natural radio emission that had been documented. Not quite like the noise from pulsars or the static from ionized gas or the interference patterns that arise when cosmic rays interact with planetary magnetic fields. The analyst who first noticed the anomaly flagged it for review, sent it up the chain with a notation that it required expert assessment, that this was outside the normal parameters of what the surveillance system was designed to detect. The signal was reviewed by specialists in radio astronomy, by physicists who understood the natural processes that generated electromagnetic radiation in space, by engineers who knew the characteristics of human-made transmitters and satellites. The consensus was uncertain, was that the signal could be natural but was unusual enough to warrant continued monitoring, to justify tasking additional resources to watch 3I divided by Atlas more closely, to see whether the emission repeated or evolved or was merely a one-time fluctuation that would never occur again. The decision was made to classify the finding, to keep it out of the public domain until more was understood, until the implications could be properly assessed and managed. This decision was not made lightly or conspiratorially, but rather followed established protocols for handling information that might have national security implications or might cause public concern if released prematurely without adequate context. The reasoning was straightforward. If the signal was natural, then there was no need to create unnecessary excitement or speculation about interstellar communication, and if the signal was somehow artificial, then even more caution was warranted, because the presence of an apparently intelligent transmission from an object that had come from another star system would raise questions that had no easy answers, would demand explanations that could not be provided without revealing capabilities and knowledge that various agencies preferred to keep confidential. And so 3I divided by Atlas entered a dual existence, studied openly by the astronomical community, who saw it as a fascinating natural object worthy of intense scientific scrutiny, while simultaneously being watched by a smaller, quieter group of observers who were looking for something else, listening for something else, waiting to see whether that brief radio emission had been a fluke or the first hint of something more complex and more significant. The public face of the investigation proceeded normally, with papers being published about the object's composition and trajectory and unusual visual characteristics, with spacecraft missions being planned to study it up close, with the whole apparatus of modern planetary science being brought to bear on understanding this interstellar visitor. But behind that public face, in rooms that did not appear on organizational charts and in reports that carried classification markings restricting their distribution to a handful of individuals with appropriate clearances, another investigation was unfolding. One focused not on what 3I divided by Atlas was, but on what it might be doing, what it might be trying to say, and to whom it might be speaking. The monitoring continued, intensive and continuous, with dedicated receiver time allocated to tracking 3I divided by Atlas as it moved through the inner solar system toward its eventual close passage around the Sunday. The object was watched not just in radio wavelengths, but across the entire electromagnetic spectrum that the surveillance systems could access, from very low-frequency emissions that can penetrate deep into planetary interiors to gamma-ray bursts that indicate high-energy particle interactions. Most of the time, 3I divided by Atlas was quiet in these exotic frequency ranges, exhibited only the expected emissions from a comet-like object being heated by the sun, releasing volatile materials and dust and creating the glowing corona that had made it so visually striking in optical images. But occasionally, perhaps once every few days, there would be another radio emission, brief and structured, and occurring at frequencies that seemed to vary in patterns that were not obviously random, that suggested perhaps some kind of internal clock or trigger mechanism was governing when and how these signals were generated. The timing of the emissions became a subject of intense analysis. Each occurrence was logged with precise timestamps, accurate to microseconds, and these timestamps were compared against every variable that might conceivably influence the object's behavior. Was there a correlation with solar activity, with the intensity of solar wind, or the occurrence of solar flares that might trigger electromagnetic responses? Was there a pattern related to the object's rotation, to which face was pointing toward the sun or toward Earth at the moment of emission? Was there any relationship to the positions of planets, to gravitational influences, or magnetic field interactions, or some other environmental factor that could explain why the emissions occurred when they did rather than at other times? What emerged from this analysis was both frustrating and fascinating. The emissions did not correlate with any obvious external variable, did not seem to be triggered by changes in the object's environment or by predictable astronomical events. The timing appeared to be internal, appeared to be governed by something within the object itself, rather than by anything happening around it. And when the analysts looked more closely at the intervals between emissions, when they examined the statistics and distributions and patterns, they found something that made several of them sit back in their chairs and stare at their screens in silence, trying to decide whether what they were seeing was real, or whether they were succumbing to the human tendency to find patterns in randomness. The intervals were not quite regular, but they were not quite random either. They clustered around certain values, showed what statisticians call a non-uniform distribution, showed that some intervals were much more common than others in ways that were difficult to explain if the emissions were just thermal noise or random quantum fluctuations. One researcher, a mathematician by training who had ended up in signals intelligence through a career path that had wandered through academia and defense contractors and eventually into the classified world, started working with the interval data in their spare time, treating it as a puzzle, a challenge to see whether meaning could be extracted from what looked like noise. They tried various approaches, looked for periodicity and harmonics and resonances, applied Fourier transforms and wavelet analysis, and every other mathematical technique they knew for finding hidden structure in time series data. Most of these attempts produced nothing interesting, generated the kind of output you would expect from random data, no significant patterns, no coherent signals emerging from the noise. But one particular analysis method, one that looked for correlations between emission timing and prime numbers, produced a result that was statistically significant at a level that could not be easily dismissed as coincidence. The correlation was not perfect, was not the kind of obviously artificial mathematical sequence that would constitute proof of intelligence or design, but it was strong enough to suggest that something non-random was happening, that the timing of emissions had been influenced or structured in ways that showed mathematical regularity. Prime numbers are interesting from a SETI perspective because they are universal mathematical concepts that any technologically advanced civilization would necessarily understand, because they represent a kind of common language that could bridge the gap between species with entirely different biologies and histories and cultural contexts. The fact that the emission timing might be related to primes, even weakly, even ambiguously, was therefore potentially significant, was the kind of finding that demanded careful consideration and further investigation. But further investigation required decisions about resources and priorities, and, most importantly, about secrecy versus disclosure. Should this finding be shared with the broader scientific community? Should civilian astronomers and SETI researchers be brought into the analysis, given access to the full dataset so that more minds could work on the problem? Or should it remain classified, kept within the intelligence community, where it could be studied without public scrutiny, without the media attention and speculation and potential panic that might arise if people believed that evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence had been detected? These questions were debated in meetings that left no paper trail, were discussed by people whose job titles gave no indication of their actual responsibilities, were eventually decided at levels of authority that operated according to logic and priorities that did not always align with what civilian scientists or the general public might consider appropriate. The decision, reached after weeks of deliberation and analysis of second and third order consequences, was to maintain the classification, but to quietly encourage certain research directions in the open scientific community, to nudge civilian astronomers toward looking at specific aspects of 3I divided by Atlas that might help confirm or refute the prime number correlation without revealing that such a correlation had already been identified. This was done through indirect means, through funding decisions that prioritized certain types of observations, through questions asked at conferences by people who seemed to be ordinary researchers but who were actually operating with a secondary agenda, through the subtle machinery of influence that shapes scientific research directions in ways that are rarely visible to the participants themselves. The result was that multiple research groups began studying the timing of 3I divided by Atlas's behavior changes, the periodicity of its light curve variations, and the patterns in its outgassing and the cycles in its magnetic field emissions. They were doing this because it seemed like interesting science, because understanding the temporal patterns of cometary activity could shed light on internal structure and composition and thermal physics. They did not know that they were being carefully observed by another set of analysts who were watching to see whether the civilian scientists would independently discover the prime number pattern, and if so, how they would interpret it, how they would present it to the world, what conclusions they would draw from evidence that was suggestive but not conclusive. As it happened, none of the civilian groups found the pattern, or at least none of them reported finding it publicly. Perhaps because they were using different analysis methods, perhaps because the classified analysis had access to better data or longer time series, perhaps because seeing patterns in ambiguous data requires not just the right tools but also the right mindset, the right questions, the right combination of skepticism and openness that allows you to notice anomalies without being overwhelmed by false positives. The pattern remained a secret, known only to that small community of analysts and administrators who were tasked with understanding what 3I divided by Atlas might represent and what, if anything, should be done about it. Meanwhile, the object continued its journey through the solar system, continued to be studied by spacecraft and telescopes. It continued to reveal layer after layer of strangeness that kept astronomers engaged and fascinated, even as they remained unaware of the radio emissions that had captured the attention of the intelligence community. The visual characteristics of 3I divided by Atlas were remarkable enough on their own. The pulsing light and geometric patterns and complex chemistry, all of which generated legitimate scientific questions and spawned legitimate research programs, trying to understand how such an object could form and survive and display the behaviors that were being observed. The fact that there might also be structured radio emissions occurring at mathematically significant times was an additional layer of mystery that most of the scientific community was not privileged to consider, was information that existed in a parallel channel of investigation that only occasionally intersected with the public research effort. The intersection points were moments of tension, times when the classified analysis revealed something that had implications for the public missions, that raised questions about safety or scientific priorities or optimal observation strategies. How much could be shared without revealing the existence of the classified program? How could advice be given, warnings be issued, resources be directed towards studying particular aspects of the object, all without explaining why these things were important, without revealing that there was a whole body of evidence and analysis that suggested 3I divided by Atlas might be more than just an unusual comet? These questions required careful navigation, required people who could operate in both worlds, who understood both the open scientific culture and the closed intelligence culture, who could translate between the two while maintaining the boundaries that separated them. One such person was a senior scientist at NASA who had security clearances that allowed access to classified information and who was also deeply involved in planning the spacecraft mission to 3I divided by Atlas. They attended meetings in both contexts, sat in briefing rooms where radio emissions and prime number correlations were discussed in hushed tones, and also sat in mission planning sessions where instrument capabilities and trajectory options were debated by researchers who had no idea that their target might be something other than a natural object. The cognitive dissonance of operating in both spaces simultaneously was challenging, required maintaining careful boundaries about what could be said in which context, required sometimes making suggestions or recommendations without being able to fully explain the reasoning behind them, required a kind of compartmentalization that felt uncomfortable but necessary. This dual context scientist was the one who suggested, in a public mission planning meeting, that it might be interesting to include a radio receiver among the spacecraft instruments, something capable of measuring electromagnetic emissions from 3I divided by Atlas at close range, something that could detect and characterize any radio signals that the object might be producing. The suggestion was presented as being motivated by scientific curiosity by the fact that comets sometimes produce radio emissions through plasma interactions, and that measuring these emissions could provide insights into the electrical and magnetic environment around the object. No mention was made of the classified observations, no hint was given that there was already evidence of radioactivity. The suggestion was simply offered as one of many possible additions to the instrument suite, left for the mission team to evaluate on its merits. The suggestion was initially met with skepticism by some team members who felt that the mass and power budgets were already tight, that adding a radio receiver would mean removing or downsizing other instruments that had clearer scientific justifications. But the dual-context scientist persisted, gently, not pushing too hard, but continuing to bring up the idea in subsequent meetings, continuing to point out that radio observations had been underutilized in previous comet missions, that this represented a chance to gather a kind of data that was rarely collected and might yield unexpected insights. Eventually, through a combination of persuasion and fortuitous circumstances involving instrument failures and budget reallocations, the radio receiver was added to the mission, was included in the final spacecraft design, though in a somewhat reduced form that would still be capable of detecting strong radio emissions if they occurred during the mission. This small victory, this subtle insertion of classified priorities into a public program, was representative of how the two investigations of 3I divided by Atlas remained connected even as they operated independently, how information and influence flowed between the classified and open worlds in ways that were carefully managed to maintain the appearance of normalcy, while quietly pursuing agendas that served broader objectives. The people making these decisions believed they were acting appropriately, believed they were balancing legitimate security concerns against scientific openness, believed they were doing what was necessary to protect sensitive information while still allowing important research to proceed. Whether they were right, whether the secrecy was justified, whether the public had a right to know what was being discovered about 3I divided by Atlas, these were questions that different people would answer differently depending on their values and priorities and beliefs about government authority and public transparency. The ethical dimensions of the classification decision were debated within the intelligence community, were the subject of memos and discussions, and occasional heated arguments between people who felt strongly that important discoveries should be shared with humanity as a whole, and people who felt equally strongly that premature disclosure of ambiguous evidence could cause more harm than good. Those who favored disclosure argued that 3I divided by Atlas represented something potentially transformative, that if the radio emissions really did indicate some form of intelligence or technology, then this was information that belonged to all humans, not just to a small group with security clearances. They argued that the history of scientific progress had always depended on open sharing of information, on independent verification and peer review, and collective analysis by researchers with diverse perspectives and expertise. They worried that keeping the findings secret would slow the pace of understanding, would prevent the best minds from contributing to solving the mystery, would mean that crucial insights might be delayed or missed entirely. Those who favored continued classification countered with arguments about caution and responsibility, about the potential for public panic or misinterpretation if information was released without adequate context and preparation. They pointed to the history of UFO reports and alien contact claims, to the way that ambiguous evidence had been seized upon by various groups to support narratives that ranged from hopeful to paranoid, to the fact that you could not unring a bell, that once information was public it could not be taken back, even if later analysis showed that initial interpretations had been wrong. They argued that the evidence from 3I divided by Atlas was still preliminary, was still open to multiple interpretations, that it would be irresponsible to make claims about intelligence or extraterrestrial communication when the data could also be explained through exotic but natural processes. They worried about the geopolitical implications, about how other nations might react to the announcement that the United States had been secretly monitoring an interstellar object and had detected potential evidence of alien technology, about whether this might trigger a new space race or arms race, or lead to international tensions that could destabilize existing treaties and cooperation frameworks. These were not frivolous concerns. were not the paranoid fantasies of security-obsessed bureaucrats, but rather represented genuine and difficult trade-offs between competing values and uncertain outcomes. The people making these decisions were trying to navigate an unprecedented situation with no clear guidelines, no historical examples to draw upon, no way to know for certain what the right course of action was. They did the best they could with the information and perspectives they had, made choices that seemed reasonable to them, even if those choices would seem questionable or wrong to others, viewing the situation from different vantage points with different information and different priorities. As months passed and more data accumulated, as the spacecraft missions successfully reached 3I divided by Atlas and returned their extraordinary findings about surface structures and complex chemistry and possible biological signatures, the pressure to disclose the classified radio observations grew stronger. The public scientific findings were themselves so strange, so unexpected, that adding the radio evidence to the mix seemed less likely to cause the kind of panic or misinterpretation that had been feared initially. If 3I divided by Atlas already appeared to be something beyond a simple comet, if it already seemed to exhibit characteristics that suggested organization or purpose, then revealing that it also produced structured radio emissions at mathematically interesting times would be confirmatory rather than revolutionary, would add detail to a picture that was already well outside the bounds of normal cometary behavior. But even as the case for disclosure strengthened, institutional inertia and classification momentum kept the information locked away. The system that had been built to protect secrets did not easily release them, required navigating bureaucratic processes and getting approvals from multiple layers of authority, required overcoming the instinctive caution of organizations that were deeply invested in controlling information flow. There were forms to fill out, reviews to conduct, risk assessments to complete, all taking time, all creating friction that made the path of least resistance be to maintain the status quo, to keep the classification in place, even as the original justifications for that classification became less compelling. And then something happened that changed the calculus, that made the question of disclosure suddenly urgent in ways that it had not been before. The lander that NASA had placed on the surface of 3I divided by Atlas, the small robotic probe that was conducting close-up measurements and sampling material and analyzing composition, detected radio emissions itself, detected them with its own instruments that had not been specifically designed for radio astronomy, but happened to be sensitive enough to register strong electromagnetic disturbances in the immediate environment. The emissions were coming from one of the bright regions, from those mysterious surface features that seemed to be the source of so much of the object's unusual behavior, and they were strong enough, close enough, that the lander's receivers captured them clearly, recorded them with high fidelity, sent the data back to Earth, where mission control teams could analyze them in detail. This detection was public, was part of the open mission, was data that would be shared with the scientific community and eventually made available in archived form for anyone to access and study. The emissions showed the same characteristics that the classified surveillance had been detecting for months, the same narrowband frequencies in the waterhole region, the same modulation patterns that suggested structure and organization. Independent researchers, civilian scientists with no access to classified information, immediately began analyzing this data, began finding the patterns, began asking the same questions that the intelligence community had been quietly working on all along. Within days of the lander data being released, papers were being posted on preprint servers suggesting that the radio emissions might not be random, might contain information, might possibly indicate some form of intelligence associated with 3I divided by Atlas. The classified program found itself suddenly overtaken by events, found that the public domain was independently discovering what had been kept secret, rendering the classification moot, making the continued withholding of information look suspicious rather than cautious. Emergency meetings were convened to discuss how to handle the situation. Whether to proactively release the surveillance data, now that the cat was essentially out of the bag anyway, or whether to maintain the classification and simply allow the civilian researchers to proceed with their analysis, which would eventually reach similar conclusions, without any need for official confirmation that the government had been watching all along. The decision was made to release the data, but carefully, through channels that would make it seem like routine declassification rather than a response to the public findings, through a process that would downplay the significance of what the surveillance had detected and would frame it as confirmatory rather than novel, as consistent with what civilian researchers were now discovering independently. A press release was prepared, reviewed by multiple agencies, watered down through successive edits until it contained almost no actual information beyond the bare fact that Area 51's surveillance systems had detected radio emissions from 3I divided by Atlas consistent with those now being reported by other sources. The release was buried on a Friday afternoon. Traditional timing for announcements that you want to minimize attention to was issued without fanfare or press conference. It was made available to journalists who were already busy covering the more exciting findings from the spacecraft missions and who mostly did not notice or did not consider newsworthy the admission that yes, the government had been listening to an interstellar object and yes, they had heard something interesting. A few reporters picked up on the story, wrote articles questioning why the information had been classified in the first place, questioning what else might be known about 3I divided by Atlas that was not being shared, questioning whether the government had evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence that was being withheld from the public. These articles gained some traction in certain circles, were shared among people who were already predisposed to believe in government conspiracies and cover-ups, were largely ignored by mainstream media, which was focused on the more concrete and scientifically grounded findings from the public research missions. The story had a brief moment of attention and then faded, displaced by other news and other controversies, leaving behind only a vague sense among some observers that there were still unanswered questions about what really happened during the 3I divided by Atlas encounter, what really was known and when, what the silence and the secrecy had really been about. For the people who had been working in the classified program, who had spent months analyzing the radio emissions and debating their implications and navigating the complex politics of information control, the public release and subsequent non-reaction was anticlimactic and somewhat frustrating. They had been sitting on what they believed was potentially one of the most significant discoveries in human history, had been carrying the weight of that knowledge in silence, and the revelation had generated barely a ripple in the broader culture. It was a lesson in how information is received and interpreted, how context and presentation matter as much as content, how the same facts can be earth-shaking or boring, depending on how they are framed and who is presenting them and what else is competing for attention in the moment. But within the scientific community, among those who were paying close attention to the 3I divided by Atlas research, the admission that government surveillance systems had detected the same radio patterns that the spacecraft had found was significant, was a piece of validation that the signals were real and consistent, that this was not an instrumental artifact or a one-time fluke, but rather something persistent and reproducible, something that demanded serious scientific explanation. Research groups began working specifically on the radio data, applying sophisticated analysis techniques, building models of how such emissions could be generated, exploring both natural and artificial hypotheses, trying to determine what the patterns meant and whether they contained decodable information. The analysis of the emission patterns became something like the analysis of pulsar signals when they were first discovered in the 1960s, when astronomers found regular radio pulses from certain points in the sky and briefly entertained the possibility that they might be artificial beacons before determining that they were natural phenomena produced by rapidly rotating neutron stars. The patterns from 3I divided by Atlas were more complex than pulsar signals, were less regular and more varied, showed what looked like intentional modulation rather than simple repetition. But they were also not obviously linguistic, did not show the kind of structure that you would expect from a message designed to be easily decoded by an unknown recipient, did not contain obvious mathematical progressions or picture encoding schemes or any of the other features that SETI researchers had theorized might appear in deliberate interstellar communications. What the patterns did show, increasingly clearly, as more data accumulated and more sophisticated analysis was applied, was correlation with the object's internal state, with the changes in brightness and heat emission and magnetic field configuration that characterized 3I divided by Atlas's behavior. When the bright regions on the surface became more active, when their light output increased and their temperature rose, the radio emissions also increased in intensity and complexity. When the bright regions were quiet, the radio was quiet too. This correlation suggested that the radio emissions were not being deliberately broadcast, but rather were a byproduct of whatever processes were occurring in those mysterious surface features, where leakage or side effects, rather than intentional communication, were the electromagnetic signature of some kind of internal activity that happened to produce radio waves as a secondary consequence. This interpretation was both disappointing and illuminating. Disappointing because it meant that 3I divided by Atlas was probably not trying to communicate with anyone, was not an alien probe sending messages home or attempting to make contact with whatever intelligences it encountered, but illuminating because it provided a new window into understanding what the object was and how it functioned, suggested that the bright regions were sites of energy transformation or chemical reactions or perhaps biological metabolism, processes intense enough to generate electromagnetic emissions detectable across millions of kilometers. If you could understand the radio patterns, you could potentially understand what was happening inside 3I divided by Atlas, could decode the emissions not as language but as diagnostic, as readouts of internal state that revealed the physics and chemistry and perhaps biology of this strange visitor. This realization shifted the focus of the radio research, moved it away from communication and toward physics, turned it into an effort to build a model that could explain how the observed emissions arose from plausible internal processes. The modeling work was challenging because it required making assumptions about composition and structure and energy sources, all of which were poorly constrained by the available data, all of which admitted numerous possibilities that could each potentially explain the observations. Some models proposed that the bright regions contained deposits of radioactive materials that were generating heat through decay, heating the surrounding ice and driving sublimation and creating charged particle flows that produced radio emissions as they interacted with magnetic fields. Other models suggested complex chemistry, exothermic reactions between organic compounds that released energy in forms that included electromagnetic radiation, reactions that might be catalyzed by sunlight or cosmic rays, or by the compounds themselves if they were organized in ways that facilitated self-sustaining processes. Still other models, more speculative and controversial, proposed that the bright regions contained something like biological activity, something like metabolism, organized systems of chemical reactions that extracted energy from their environment and used it to maintain structure and function. Systems that might have evolved in another stellar system under conditions very different from Earth, but that operated according to the same basic thermodynamic principles that governed all life, that required energy input and produced waste heat and electromagnetic emissions as byproducts of their operation. These biological models were difficult to test with the available data, required making assumptions about what alien biochemistry might look like and how it might function, required speculating about metabolic pathways and energy sources that had no terrestrial analogues. But they had the advantage of explaining not just the radio emissions, but also the other strange characteristics of 3I divided by Atlas, the organized surface structures and the complex organic chemistry and the apparent responsiveness to environmental changes, all of which seemed more consistent with biology than with simple geology. The debate between these different models was ongoing, was being conducted in research papers and conference presentations and informal discussions among scientists trying to make sense of an object that continued to defy easy categorization. Area 51's contribution to this debate was now limited, was reduced to being just another source of data rather than the primary investigator, was no longer operating in the shadows, but rather in the open, alongside all the other research groups. The special knowledge that had existed in the classified program, the months of head start in analyzing the radio emissions, had been largely absorbed into the public research effort, had been integrated into the broader scientific understanding without leaving much trace of its origins in surveillance and secrecy. But there remained one aspect of the classified investigation that had not been released, one finding that was still considered too sensitive or too uncertain or too potentially inflammatory to share publicly. This was the prime number correlation, the statistical relationship between emission timing and prime integers that the mathematician turned analyst had discovered during their late-night explorations of the data. This finding had been reviewed repeatedly, had been checked and verified and tested against random data, and had consistently shown significance levels that were hard to dismiss as coincidence. But it also remained unexplained, remained without a clear physical mechanism that could account for why the timing of natural or biological processes would show any relationship to mathematical abstractions like prime numbers. The correlation haunted the analysts who knew about it, hung over their interpretations of all the other findings, raised questions that they could not answer and could not ignore. If the correlation was real, if it was not a statistical fluke or an artifact of how the analysis had been conducted, then what did it mean? Did it suggest that whatever was producing the radio emissions had some kind of mathematical awareness, some capacity, to structure its behavior according to numerical patterns that had no obvious relevance to physics or chemistry or biology? Did it suggest that the emissions were after all communicative rather than merely diagnostic, that they were being structured deliberately to convey information even if that information was not a linguistic message in any conventional sense? Or was the correlation meaningless? Was it the kind of spurious pattern that emerges when you analyze complex data with enough different methods? Was it simply the human mind finding order in chaos, because finding order is what human minds do, is how they make sense of a universe that is fundamentally noisy and ambiguous? These questions could not be resolved with the existing data, would require more observations over longer time periods, would require ideally some kind of experimental manipulation where the object's environment could be changed systematically to see whether the emission patterns responded in predictable ways, to see whether the timing correlation held up under different conditions or broke down when key variables were altered. But 3I divided by Atlas was already leaving the solar system, was already too far away for detailed study, was receding into the distance where it would eventually become undetectable even to the most sensitive instruments. The window for investigation was closing, was perhaps already closed, was leaving behind a dataset that was extensive but incomplete, that contained enough information to generate fascinating questions, but not quite enough to provide definitive answers. The object would continue its journey through the galaxy, would perhaps pass through other star systems in the distant future where other civilizations might detect and study and wonder about it, might find their own patterns and mysteries in its behavior, might add their own layers to whatever history and meaning the object carried. For humanity, the encounter with 3I divided by Atlas would remain a moment of profound ambiguity. A time when we thought we might be on the verge of confirming that we were not alone, that intelligence existed elsewhere in the universe, that the cosmos was full of meaning and purpose beyond our own. The evidence never quite coalesced into certainty, never quite crossed the threshold from intriguing to conclusive, left us in a state of uncertainty that was in some ways more challenging than either confirmation or denial would have been. If we had found clear proof of alien intelligence, we could have responded to that, could have made decisions about how to proceed, how to communicate, how to integrate this knowledge into our understanding of ourselves and our future. If we had found clear evidence that 3I divided by Atlas was purely natural, we could have relaxed, could have filed away the mystery as solved, could have returned to the comfortable assumption that we were effectively alone, at least in our local neighborhood of the galaxy. Instead, we were left with ambiguity, with patterns that might mean something or might mean nothing, with correlations that might indicate intelligence or might indicate nothing more than the human capacity to find patterns in noise. This ambiguity was uncomfortable, violated our desire for clear answers and definite knowledge, left us suspended between possibilities without a clear resolution. But it was also perhaps appropriate, was perhaps reflective of the actual nature of the universe, which is not obligated to provide us with clear answers or definite knowledge, which operates according to its own logic and reveals itself in its own time and on its own terms, which cares nothing for our desire for certainty and understanding. Area 51's role in all of this, its months of secret observation and analysis and debate, was ultimately a footnote to the larger story, a reminder that information is controlled and managed and shaped by institutions with their own priorities and perspectives. That what the public knows and when they know it is not simply a matter of scientific discovery, but also a matter of policy and politics and calculation about consequences. The silence that surrounded the radio observations for those crucial months was not malicious, was not intended to deny humanity knowledge to which it was entitled, but rather reflected genuine uncertainty about how to handle unprecedented information, reflected institutional caution and risk aversion, and the tendency of bureaucracies to default to secrecy when facing decisions that might have unpredictable consequences. Whether that silence was justified, whether the temporary withholding of information served any legitimate purpose or simply delayed the inevitable process of scientific discovery and public awareness, these are questions that reasonable people can disagree about, that depend on assumptions about government authority and public competence and the value of openness versus the value of caution. What is clear is that the silence ended not because of a deliberate decision to embrace transparency, but because events overtook policy, because the public mission discovered independently what the classified program had been observing all along, because the universe itself was not interested in maintaining the boundaries between classified and open information, between secret knowledge and public knowledge, between what Area 51 knew and what the rest of us were allowed to see. And now, years after the encounter, after 3i divided by Atlas has departed back into interstellar space, and the immediate urgency has faded, and the research has settled into the slower rhythms of long-term analysis and modeling, what remains is a collection of data and images and measurements, a record of humanity's interaction with something from beyond our solar system, something that might have been alive, or intelligent, or simply very strange. Something that touched our world briefly and then moved on, leaving behind questions that may never be fully answered. The data sits in archives, accessible to anyone with the time and expertise to analyze it, no longer classified, no longer secret, but also no longer generating the intense interest and excitement that characterized the encounter itself. The papers continue to be published, the models continue to be refined, the debates continue about what the evidence means and what conclusions are warranted. But the moment has passed, the unique opportunity has ended, and we are left with what we have, with partial understanding and lingering mysteries, and the knowledge that we encountered something extraordinary and did not quite manage to understand it. Area 51 continues its work, continues its monitoring of the skies, continues to collect signals and analyze patterns, and look for anomalies that might indicate threats or opportunities, or simply interesting phenomena worthy of attention. The analysts who worked on 3i divided by Atlas have moved on to other projects, other mysteries, other classified investigations that they cannot discuss with family or friends or colleagues without appropriate clearances. Some of them still think about the prime number correlation, still wonder whether it was real, still hope that someday more data, or better analysis, or new theoretical insights will resolve the question that haunted their late nights and early mornings during those intense months of investigation. They know things about 3i divided by Atlas that most people do not know. Not because those things are still classified, but simply because they lived with the data more intimately than almost anyone else, because they spent hundreds of hours staring at spectrograms and time series and statistical outputs, because they developed an intuitive sense for the patterns and rhythms of the object's behavior that cannot easily be conveyed in papers or presentations. But what they know is not fundamentally different from what anyone willing to work through the archived data could discover for themselves, is not secret in any meaningful sense anymore, is simply knowledge that requires time and effort and expertise to access. The mystique of Area 51, the assumption that it holds dramatic secrets about aliens and UFOs and extraterrestrial contact, is mostly unwarranted, is mostly a projection of human desires and fears onto a facility that does classified work, but mostly boring classified work. Mostly the routine business of surveillance and intelligence gathering and weapons testing that is necessary for national security, but is rarely as exciting or revelatory as popular imagination suggests. 3i divided by Atlas was a rare exception, was a genuinely extraordinary subject that briefly elevated the facility's work into realms of cosmic significance, that made the analysts feel like they were participants in something historically important rather than just cogs in a bureaucratic machine. But even that extraordinary encounter ended up being less about secrets and more about science, less about what Area 51 uniquely knew and more about what the entire scientific community was discovering collectively through open research and collaboration and the normal processes of investigation and analysis that have all characterized humanity's efforts to understand the natural world. The real significance of Area 51's involvement with 3i divided by Atlas is not about secrets that remain hidden or knowledge that is being suppressed, but rather about the complicated relationship between classified and open science, about how information flows and is controlled and eventually released, about how institutions make decisions about what to share and what to withhold, and how those decisions affect the pace and direction of scientific discovery. These are important questions. Questions about power and transparency and trust. Questions about who gets to decide what humanity knows about the universe and when we get to know it. But they are not questions that have simple answers or obvious villains, are not questions that reduce to conspiracies or cover-ups, are rather questions that involve genuine trade-offs and difficult judgments and competing values that cannot all be satisfied simultaneously. And so we are left at the end of this story where we began, with questions and mysteries and partial understanding, with the knowledge that something remarkable passed through our solar system and we did our best to study it and learn from it, even as we struggled with our own limitations and uncertainties and institutional complexities. Area 51 played its role, contributed its data, maintained its secrets until they were no longer secret, and then returned to its regular work of watching the skies and listening to the universe, waiting for the next anomaly, the next mystery, the next visitor from beyond that might teach us something about the cosmos and about ourselves. The image of 3i divided by Atlas remains, captured in photographs and data files and human memory, that strange glowing object tumbling through the dark, pulsing with its mysterious rhythms, carrying its cargo of complex chemistry and possible biology and unexplained patterns, moving through space in ways that seemed almost purposeful, even though purpose might have been only our projection, our tendency to see intention and meaning where perhaps none existed. Whether 3i divided by Atlas was alive or dead, intelligent or mindless, natural or artificial, these questions remain open, remain subjects of debate and speculation and ongoing research, remain mysteries that the universe has presented to us without providing clear solutions. What we know is what we observed, what we measured, what we recorded in the brief time that the object was within reach of our instruments and our curiosity. What Area 51 knew was not dramatically different from what everyone else could eventually know, was simply accessed earlier and in a different context, through systems designed for surveillance rather than astronomy, through organizational structures oriented towards security rather than openness, The months of classified observation revealed patterns and correlations that were intriguing and possibly significant, but they did not provide definitive answers, did not resolve the fundamental mysteries, did not transform our understanding of life and intelligence in the universe in the way that clear evidence of extraterrestrial civilization would have done. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson, that the universe does not owe us clarity, does not provide neat resolutions to every mystery we encounter, that we must learn to live with ambiguity and uncertainty and questions that have no clear answers. 3i divided by Atlas gave us a glimpse of something strange and wonderful, something that challenged our assumptions and expanded our imagination, something that reminded us that reality is larger and more complex than our models and theories can fully capture. Whether it was a messenger from another civilization, or simply a remarkably unusual natural object, whether its patterns contained meaning or were merely the accidental byproducts of exotic chemistry and physics, these questions may never be fully resolved, may remain forever in that liminal space between possibility and confirmation, between hope and verification. The desert around Area 51 stretches out empty and silent under stars that are themselves messages from the past, light that has traveled for years or centuries or millennia to reach Earth, information about conditions that existed long ago in places unimaginably distant. The facility sits in that landscape like a human effort to listen to those messages, to decode the signals that rain down constantly from the cosmos, to sort through the noise and find the patterns that might indicate something more than random fluctuation, something more than the blind operation of physical law. Sometimes the patterns are real, and sometimes they are illusions created by our desire to find meaning, and learning to distinguish between these possibilities requires patience and rigor and willingness to accept uncertainty when certainty is not available. 3i divided by Atlas has moved on, has left our solar system and returned to the interstellar void, is once again falling through the darkness at speeds that will carry it across parsecs and light years, will eventually bring it to other stars and other planets, will perhaps allow it to complete whatever function or purpose or random trajectory has characterized its existence for hundreds of millions of years. We had our moment with it, our brief chance to observe and study and wonder, and now it is gone, leaving behind data and memories and questions that will occupy researchers for years or decades to come, leaving behind a reminder that we are not alone in the universe, even if we are not yet certain exactly what else is out there with us. The silence of the desert matches the silence of space. Both are vast and empty in ways that make human concern seem small and temporary. Both are full of hidden complexity if you have the instruments to detect it and the patience to look carefully. Both hold mysteries that resist easy interpretation and demand sustained attention and careful analysis to begin to understand. Area 51 exists in that intersection between desert silence and cosmic silence, is a place where humans try to bridge the gap, try to extract meaning from the void, try to hear the faint whispers that might indicate we are not the only ones asking questions about what else exists in the universe. Whether those whispers from 3i divided by Atlas were real or imagined, whether they carried information or were simply noise, whether they indicated intelligence or merely complex chemistry, these remain open questions, remain subjects for future research and future debate, remain mysteries that this generation has encountered but not resolved, that will be passed forward to those who come after us, who will have new tools and new perspectives and perhaps new evidence that will finally settle questions that we could only approach without fully answering. And so the story ends not with revelation but with continuation, not with answers but with better questions, not with certainty but with deepened appreciation for how much we do not yet know, how much remains to be discovered, how vast and strange the universe is, and how small and tentative our understanding remains, despite all our technology and intelligence and effort. Area 51 keeps its watch. The scientists continue their work. The universe continues to unfold in ways that surprise and challenge and inspire us, and somewhere far beyond our reach. 3. I divided by Atlas continues its journey, carrying whatever secrets it holds deeper into the galaxy, leaving us behind with our incomplete data and our lingering questions, and our wondering whether we missed something crucial in that brief moment of contact. Whether there was a message we failed to decode, whether intelligence looked at us and we failed to recognize it because we were looking for the wrong kind of signs. The night is quiet here at the end of the story. Quiet in the way that invites reflection and contemplation, that allows thoughts to settle like dust after a windstorm, that creates space for wondering about what might be true and what we can never know for certain. The stars are visible, if you look up, are the same stars that 3I divided by Atlas passed among on its long journey to our solar system, are the same stars that it will pass among on its continuing journey outward, are points of light that represent entire worlds and histories, and possibilities that we can barely imagine from our small perspective. Here on one planet, orbiting one unremarkable star in a galaxy full of hundreds of billions of similar stars, we are learning to read the messages that come from those stars, learning to detect planets and characterize atmospheres and search for biosignatures and technosignatures, learning to expand our understanding of what is possible and what actually exists beyond our immediate experience. 3I divided by Atlas was part of that learning, was a teacher that appeared briefly and then departed, was a puzzle that we partially solved and partially did not, was a reminder that the universe is under no obligation to make itself easily comprehensible to us, that discovery requires patience and persistence and willingness to accept that some questions may never have clear answers. Area 51's role in this story, its contribution to our understanding of 3I divided by Atlas, was ultimately less significant than the mythology surrounding the facility might suggest, was less about hidden knowledge and dramatic secrets, and more about the ordinary complexities of how information is managed and controlled in a world where science and security intersect, where institutional priorities sometimes conflict with ideals of openness and transparency, where decisions are made by people trying to do what seems right with incomplete information and uncertain consequences. The facility watched and listened, recorded and analyzed, contributed data, that eventually merged with the larger stream of scientific investigation and then returned to its ongoing mission of monitoring the skies for threats and anomalies and interesting phenomena. The deeper truth is that what Area 51 knows about 3I divided by Atlas is now available to anyone who wants to look, is encoded in archived data and published papers and publicly accessible databases, is no longer secret in any meaningful sense, is simply information that requires effort to access and expertise to interpret. The real secrets, if any remain, are not held by government facilities or intelligence agencies, but rather by the universe itself, by the vast reaches of space that we have barely begun to explore, by the processes and phenomena that operate on scales and in conditions that we cannot yet reproduce or fully understand, by the possible forms of life and intelligence that might exist in environments so different from Earth that we would not recognize them even if we saw them. These are the secrets worth pursuing, the mysteries worth investigating, the questions that will occupy humanity for as long as we maintain our curiosity and our capacity for wonder. Area 51 and its brief intensive study of 3I divided by Atlas represents one small effort in that larger pursuit, one facility among many, one dataset among thousands, one contribution to the collective human project of understanding what exists beyond our immediate experience, what the universe contains, what possibilities wait to be discovered in the darkness between the stars. And so we return at the end to where we began, to that image of 3I divided by Atlas moving through space, glowing with its mysterious light, sending its ambiguous signals, being watched from a distance by instruments and analysts who were trying to understand what they were seeing, who recorded and measured and debated and eventually shared what they found with a broader community of researchers who took up the analysis and carried it forward. The story is not about conspiracy or cover-up, is not about secret knowledge being withheld from humanity, is rather about the messy, complicated process of discovery and understanding, about how we collectively work through mysteries and uncertainties, about how information flows through different channels and eventually converges into shared knowledge, about how science proceeds through observation and analysis and debate and gradual accumulation of evidence and insight. The silence around certain aspects of the investigation was temporary, was a pause rather than a permanent suppression, was eventually overtaken by events and by independent discovery and by the inherent tendency of scientific information to spread and be shared despite barriers and restrictions. What Area 51 knew about 3I divided by Atlas that we did not is now what we all know. Is part of the collective understanding that emerged from the encounter, is available to anyone who cares to look, who cares to wonder, who cares to engage with the mystery and the beauty and the strangeness of an object that came from another star and passed briefly through our lives before continuing on its eternal journey through the galaxy. The night is deep now, is wrapping around like a blanket, is inviting rest and dreams, and the kind of reflection that comes when the immediate urgency fades and we can think about what things mean rather than just what things are. 3I divided by Atlas meant something different to everyone who encountered it, meant scientific opportunity to researchers, meant potential threat to security analysts, meant wonder and possibility to the broader public, meant different things to different people depending on their perspectives and priorities and hopes. But it meant something, was significant, was important, was a moment when humanity encountered something from beyond our familiar boundaries and responded with curiosity and effort and the determination to understand as much as possible in the time available. That response, that collective effort to study and analyze and make sense of the mystery, was perhaps more revealing about humanity than any specific finding about 3I divided by Atlas itself. It showed our capacity for cooperation and competition, for openness and secrecy, for scientific rigor and imaginative speculation, for bureaucratic caution and individual courage, for all the complexity and contradiction that characterizes our species and our civilization. We are not simple, are not easily categorized, contain multitudes and contradictions, approach mysteries with tools and methods and attitudes that reflect our history and our values, and our uncertainties about who we are and what we should be doing with the brief time we have in this universe. 3I divided by Atlas is gone now, is beyond our reach, is continuing its journey without us, is perhaps already forgetting if it ever had memory, is perhaps still carrying some record of its passage through our solar system. Some physical or electromagnetic trace that might be detected by future civilizations if it passes through other inhabited systems in the millions or billions of years ahead. We are left with our records, and our memories and our questions are left to continue the work of understanding, are left to wait and watch and wonder whether other visitors will come, whether 3I divided by Atlas will be the first of many interstellar objects that we study and learn from, or whether it will remain a unique event, a singular encounter that defined this moment in human history, but was never repeated. Only time will tell. Only continued observation will reveal what else exists in the darkness, what else is moving through the galaxy on trajectories that might intersect with ours, what else might appear in our telescopes and our receivers as mysterious and challenging and potentially transformative. We watch and we wait, equipped now with better tools and better understanding than we had before. 3I divided by Atlas appeared, ready now to respond more effectively to the next anomaly, the next mystery, the next visitor from the stars. And in the desert, under those same stars, Area 51 continues its watch, continues its mission of monitoring and analyzing and protecting continues to hold its mixture of mundane routine and occasional extraordinary encounter, continues to be a symbol of secrecy and a reality of classified work that is usually less exciting than popular imagination suggests, but occasionally, very occasionally, touches something cosmic and strange and worthy of the mysteries and legends that have accumulated around that remote facility in the Nevada wasteland. The story of what Area 51 knows about 3I divided by Atlas is ultimately the story of what we all know now, what we discovered collectively through multiple channels and multiple methods, what emerged from the combination of classified surveillance and open science, what was revealed through patience and persistence, and the universe's own tendency to eventually expose its secrets to those who look carefully enough and long enough. There are no dramatic revelations waiting to be disclosed, no shocking evidence that has been suppressed, no proof of alien contact that is being hidden in secure vaults. There is only the ambiguous evidence, the intriguing patterns, the questions that remain open despite intensive investigation, the recognition that we encountered something extraordinary and did our imperfect human best to understand it with the tools and knowledge and institutional structures we have available. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all we can reasonably expect, that we try and sometimes succeed and sometimes fail, and always learn something from the effort, that we push against the boundaries of our understanding and occasionally move them outward a little, that we maintain our curiosity and our capacity for wonder even in the face of ambiguity and uncertainty and questions that resist easy answers. 3I divided by Atlas gave us an opportunity to practice these virtues, to demonstrate these capacities, to show that we can respond to cosmic mystery with something more than fear or indifference, that we can mobilize our scientific resources and our creative intelligence and our institutional capabilities to study and analyze and try to understand something that challenges our existing frameworks and assumptions. The encounter is over, but its effects continue, rippling outward through the scientific community and the broader culture, influencing how we think about comets and interstellar objects and the possibility of life beyond Earth, influencing funding priorities and research directions and the questions that the next generation of astronomers and astrobiologists and planetary scientists will pursue with the tools and techniques that are being developed now to prepare for future encounters, future mysteries, future visitors from beyond our solar system. We are better prepared now because of 3I divided by Atlas, have learned lessons about what to look for and how to respond, have developed protocols and capabilities and understandings that will make the next encounter more productive, will allow us to extract more information more quickly, will perhaps finally answer some of the questions that 3I divided by Atlas raised but did not resolve. We are moving forward, slowly and imperfectly, but persistently, expanding our knowledge and our capabilities, reaching toward understanding with the recognition that complete understanding may always remain just beyond our grasp, but that the reaching itself is valuable, is what makes us human, is what gives meaning to our existence in a universe that is vast and ancient and full of wonders that we are only beginning to perceive. The silence returns now, the calm quiet that comes at the end of a long story. The sense of completion, even though the story itself remains unfinished, remains open to continuation and revision as new information emerges and new perspectives develop. Area 51 fades back into the desert landscape, becomes again just a facility among facilities, doing its classified work away from public scrutiny, occasionally touching mysteries, but mostly dealing with the routine complexities of surveillance and intelligence and national security in a complicated world. 3I divided by Atlas fades back into the cosmic darkness, becomes again just an object among billions, tumbling through space on its ancient trajectory, carrying whatever it carries toward whatever future awaits it in the unimaginable distances and times ahead. And we remain here, on our small planet orbiting our ordinary star, looking up at the night sky with wonder and curiosity and the questions that define our species and our civilization, waiting for the next mystery, the next discovery, the next moment when the universe reveals something that challenges our understanding and invites us to think more deeply about where we are and what else might be out there in the darkness, watching us as we watch the stars, wondering about us as we wonder about them, participating in some vast cosmic story that we can only dimly perceive but cannot help trying to understand. The story ends here, where understanding begins, where knowledge gives way to mystery, where what we know meets what we can only wonder about, where the silence of space invites contemplation and the distances invite imagination and the questions invite continued seeking, continued searching, continued hoping that someday, perhaps soon or perhaps in some distant future, we will finally understand what 3I divided by Atlas was, what its visit meant, what its patterns were trying to tell us, and what, if anything, Area 51 knew that could have made the difference between mystery and revelation, between wonder and certainty, between questions and answers, in the endless conversation between humanity and the universe that surrounds us. Sleep well, and let the mysteries of the cosmos drift through your dreams. Let the image of 3I divided by Atlas float through your consciousness like a memory of something half-remembered. Let the questions settle into the quiet spaces of your mind, where they can germinate and grow, and perhaps someday bloom into understanding, or perhaps simply remain as beautiful reminders that we live in a universe far stranger and more wonderful than we can fully comprehend, far more full of possibility than our theories can capture, far more mysterious than our instruments can reveal, and that this mystery is not something to fear, but rather something to celebrate, something to appreciate, something that makes existence richer and more meaningful, and more worth the brief time we have to experience it, before we too fade back into the cosmic darkness from which we emerged, and to which we will all eventually return.